Hopefully you will remember that in our initial discussion, I mentioned that feudalism was in crisis by 1500. Kings began to try to assert their authority and turn their theoretical power into actual power. When they succeeded, they became what is known as absolute rulers. Those that failed were forced to adopt a constitutional form of government. For now, we will discuss absolutism. The best example of absolutism in practice was in France, so I'm going to use France as an example to illustrate absolutism. I wish to define absolutism as follows. An absolute state is one in which the sovereign power and the ultimate authority of that state rests in the hands of a king who rules by divine right. By divine right, political theorists of the 17th century argued that the authority of absolutist kings came directly from God, which meant that it was unchallengeable. In an absolute state, the king had sole authority to make laws, raise taxes, administer justice, conduct foreign affairs, and control the administration. Absolute was a good word to use to describe the powers of a king in such a situation. In an absolute system, there was no higher authority than the king. This means that he didn't have to listen to anyone or ask anyone for power and authority. The king himself was the law, so he couldn't be held accountable to it. It could be changed at his whim. Think about it. If the king made the law, could he do something illegal? That would be a contradiction. The king was the law and couldn't break it. Rather, he would change it to suit his needs. While we see some examples of how absolute kings may not have actually held all the power they thought they did, technically speaking, his absolute authority meant that he wasn't required to ask permission of any law, parliament, or person before acting. The book that best sums up what absolutism meant to people living in the 1600s is Bishop Bossuet's Politics Drawn from the Very Words of Holy Scripture. In this book, Bossuet discusses what the Bible says about kingship. In particular, he highlights those areas in the Old Testament where it's clear that God had divinely sanctioned men to be king. Bossuet says this still applied, and that the kings of France had been selected by God, just like the kings of Israel had been. If the king had been chosen by God, how could anyone try to overthrow him, or even disagree with him? He was the Lord's anointed. It is true that Bossuet also pointed out that absolute kings were accountable to the people as well. They were to look after them like their own children. Nonetheless, as you can probably imagine, most kings paid more attention to the areas giving kings authority than to those sections that talked about duty. Another important summation of absolute power comes from the greatest of France's absolute kings, Louis XIV. He was supposed to have said, "L'état c'est moi," French for "I am the state." What he was getting at was this: all of the power and authority of the state was his, a good summary of what absolutism meant. Louis XIV's descendant provided a bit longer definition of absolutism. Louis XV said, "It is in my person alone that sovereign power resides. It is from me alone that my courts of justice derive their existence and their authority. The plenitude or fullness of this authority, which they exercise only in my name, remains always with me. I alone possess legislative power without sharing it with or depending for it on anyone. The whole system of public order emanates from me." It is clear from this summary that Louis XV thought of himself as the sole source of authority in France. He was the chief justice of the courts, the head of the legislature, and the chief police officer, in addition to being king. He truly thought himself absolute. Now we are going to see why absolutism developed in this way in France. At the outset, I want to point out that the emphasis on the king's power was a result of a number of threats on the king's power developing at the end of the 1500s. After all, you'll remember from our discussion of the Protestant Reformation that France had just fought an extensive civil war. It was important for the kings of France to show everyone that these wars were over and that the kings were back in charge, not the nobility, who had been more powerful than the king at certain points of the Civil War. Another interesting phenomenon that occurred at this period were royal minorities. For a variety of different reasons, a whole series of French kings came to the throne while they were still children and unable to rule on their own. It was important to maintain that even though advisors were actually running the country while the king was a child or teenager, that the king was still in charge and that he would retake his power when he got old enough. The story of French absolutism starts with Henry IV, who you should remember was the old Henry of Navarre, the Protestant who won the French religious civil wars and then converted to Catholicism. Clearly, he knew that the authority of the king could be challenged, since he had done so. Henry began the trend towards royal absolutism, but he hadn't gotten very far before he was assassinated in 1610 by an angry Catholic who felt, probably correctly, that Henry had converted for political reasons and wasn't a very good Catholic. Henry's son, Louis, became king when his father was killed, but he was only 8 years old at the time. As a result, advisors ran the kingdom for him. When he became old enough to run the kingdom on his own, he decided to select an advisor who would help him run the kingdom and increase royal power. The man he chose was the Cardinal Richelieu, pictured here at the lower right. Richelieu was a cardinal in the church, which was the second highest position possible, just below Pope. In fact, the cardinals were the men who gathered together to elect the next pope when the current pope died. Richelieu was therefore a powerful man within the Catholic Church, and worked closely with Louis XIII to establish Absolutism in France. Richelieu was a good choice as chief minister. First of all, he was a priest, which meant that he could not marry and would never have children. This is important because he had no incentive to try and build up wealth and power for his own family, because he didn't have one. If Louis had chosen a French nobleman to rule with him, that nobleman would have had a strong incentive to help out his own family, or maybe even to try to seize the throne for himself. Louis didn't have to worry about that with Richelieu. Richelieu made it his chief goal to increase the power of the king. Since the king was the one who appointed him, he knew that whenever the powers of the king would be increased, they would be handed down to him. His main opponents were the French nobility. These noblemen had traditionally worked with the king. Richelieu wanted to take away their power and give it to the king. As a result, the French nobility loathed him. I'll give you a specific example of a way in which Richelieu took away power from the nobility and gave it to the king. The practice of dueling was outlawed. Duels were when two men had a conflict between them that they resolved by fighting each other with swords. The winner won the argument. Richelieu didn't ban dueling because he didn't want noblemen killing each other. He didn't mind that too much. Instead, he didn't like dueling because dueling took power away from the king. After all, when two people got into a dispute, they should have taken their problem to the king to decide. By dueling, they were essentially deciding the issue for themselves. Since Richelieu and the king wanted to be able to decide these disputes, they did away with dueling. Cardinal Richelieu was appointed as Louis's chief minister in 1624, and he would keep that position until his death in 1642. When Cardinal Richelieu died, Louis XIII appointed Richelieu's close advisor to replace him as prime minister. This man was another cardinal of the church, Jules Mazarin. The nobles hated Mazarin, as they had Richelieu, but they hated Mazarin even more. As you might be able to tell from the pronunciation of their names, Richelieu was a Frenchman, but Mazarin was an Italian. Mazarin worked closely with Louis's wife, Queen Anne, who was from Austria. When Louis died the next year, his son was only 5 years old, and Mazarin stepped in to govern the state with the queen until the young boy could grow up. What this meant, though, was that France was being effectively governed by an Italian cardinal and an Austrian queen. You can imagine how much the French nobility enjoyed that. In addition, the cardinal and the queen worked together so well that rumors quickly developed about how deep their relationship went. Not only was the cardinal supposed to remain celibate, but he definitely shouldn't be having an affair with the queen. Whether this affair happened or not, many Frenchmen thought it did, and that would prove enough. Eventually, enough was enough for the French nobility. The young king, Louis XIV, was only 10, but the French nobility sparked a rebellion against Mazarin in 1648. The revolt was called the Fronde, which is the French word for the type of slingshot that was used to signal the beginning of the uprising. The French participating in the Fronde were in a difficult position. They hated Mazarin, but didn't want to seem to be fighting against the king. That would have been treason, with the terrible consequences I mentioned in the first lecture. Even though Mazarin was driven from Paris early in the revolt, the problems of trying to fight Mazarin while not fighting the king proved to be too much. After 5 years, the rebellion ended, and Mazarin remained the chief minister in France. In the end, the Fronde accomplished little, and would be the last major revolt of the nobility against the French government. It did have an impact on the young king, which we will see momentarily. Mazarin, however, kept his power, and he would remain the prime minister until his death in 1661. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV was faced with his first major challenge: who to choose as the next prime minister. He chose the person he was most comfortable working with and who he trusted the most: himself. Breaking with his father's ways, Louis XIV decided to rule on his own, without a chief minister. Thus, Louis XIII, Richelieu, and Mazarin prepared the way for absolutism, but it was Louis XIV who can be considered the first monarch to try to rule absolutely. To get a good sense of Louis's power, I have divided his areas of power into 5 sections. Louis practiced absolutism domestically, politically, religiously, economically, and militarily. First, Louis's domestic authority. As I mentioned just before, the Fronde had an impact on Louis. No longer did he trust his nobility, and he also developed an aversion to Paris. As a result, he decided to move out of Paris to another royal palace. To that end, he ordered the construction of the vast Palace of Versailles. Not only did he move from Paris, but he also transferred the capital to Versailles. Under an absolute system, the capital is wherever the absolute monarch lives, so this would be now Versailles, not Paris. Could Louis do this? It hadn't been tried before. But the answer is clearly yes. Louis could do it because he was an absolute monarch. By moving the capital, he not only avoided Paris, but he asserted his power and authority. His desires would have to be accommodated by the French. There were other reasons to move the capital to Versailles that I will discuss shortly. Building a new royal palace was also the opportunity to show off. This politics of display means that Louis would show his power by building a palace that was so enormous and costly that no one could question his power and authority. This is an image showing the most magnificent of the rooms within the palace, the Hall of Mirrors. This vast throne room was lined with mirrors along one side, giving the illusion that the room was immense. The king sat on a raised throne at one end of the room, and visitors were required to travel the distance of the room in order to speak with him. All of this was designed to magnify the power of the king. Here is the royal staircase. Once again, you can see the ways in which the architecture of the building was designed to magnify the king and minimize everyone else. This is a victorious general returning to the king. He advanced slowly to the king, bowing to him, to show that although he had won the battle, that the king retained the power. This is the magnificent royal chapel. Louis had a church built and attached to the palace, so that he could attend without leaving his palace. It was also a place for those who were at Versailles to attend religious services. As you can tell from this image, it is an opulent building, covered in gold and elaborate murals. This is an image looking out the back of the palace across the royal gardens. The king's private garden extended as far as the eye could see, and was dotted with countless fountains. In fact, the gardens, fountain, and palace required so much water that Louis had an entire river diverted to flow to the palace to provide for his needs. In the end, the formal gardens covered 250 acres, and the entire estate covered 2,000 acres. This is the entrance to the palace. As you can see, the 3-story palace was gargantuan. I chose this particular image because you can see the people in the foreground as a comparison to see how large the entrance to the building truly was. The palace was so large, in fact, that the king soon constructed a private retreat known as the Grand Trianon on the estate. This was where he would go with his family to get away from it all. The queen soon needed her own private estate, which became known as the Petit Trianon. Louis used this palace for a variety of purposes. As already mentioned, it was the royal palace and the royal reception hall. When he transferred the capital to Versailles, he also moved the government offices to the Versailles complex. Perhaps more impressive is the fact that he had over 350 apartments built into his palace, and the entire complex housed over 6,000 people. All the government officials had to move to Versailles from Paris if they wished to continue their jobs. Thus, Louis forced the entire government to become entirely dependent on him and his household for all of their needs. This is an image of Louis's bedroom, and it symbolizes another way in which Louis controlled his government. At the end of the day, Louis would reward one of his courtiers by granting him the right of coucher, the right to put him to sleep. This person would accompany Louis as he prepared to go to bed, and would make sure that the king was set up before departing. At first sight, this might seem humiliating. What nobleman would want such a job? After all, not that long ago, nobles were challenging the kings of France to run the country. Now they were tucking him into bed at night and thanking him for the privilege. Nevertheless, there is some prestige to such a right. After all, as you can see from this and the preceding images, the king was constantly surrounded by people. It was very rare for anyone to get one-on-one time with the king. The coucher gave them this opportunity to try to persuade the king to his point of view. Much of what I have considered to be the domestic authority of Louis XIV can also be seen to have had political consequences. Louis considered himself an absolute ruler who ought to control his country as tightly and firmly as he could. He accomplished this by his system of intendants. An intendant was an official appointed by the king to be the king's government representative in a district. In the past, the French nobility governed local districts, but one of Louis's key programs was to reduce the power of the nobility and take that power himself. Also, remember that the prominent nobility were no longer living in their districts, but at Versailles. It is obvious that one man couldn't micromanage the entire nation of millions of people, so Louis used his intendants. These officials would be given charge over an area by the king, and they would govern in his name. Generally, Louis chose middle-class men for these roles. He did this on purpose. After all, most middle-class Frenchmen had no political power. Any authority that they received as intendants was given to them directly from the king. If the king didn't like the job they did, he could fire them with no consequences, because he wasn't worried about a group of middle-class lawyers rebelling against him. As a result of using these intendants, Louis was able, as far as the technology of the day and the limits of human ability would enable him, to control his state. Louis was not content to limit his rule to domestic and political matters. He also wanted to govern them religiously. You will remember that Henry IV issued the Edict of Nantes, which allowed Protestantism in 10 French cities. Louis XIV was a Catholic, and he was worried that not all of his nation was Catholic. In particular, he worried that Protestants weren't as loyal to him as were his Catholic subjects. After all, French Protestants had rebelled against the king within recent memory. Because of that, Louis issued the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685. This rule repealed the Edict of Nantes and took away the protection of Protestants in those 10 French cities. From this point on, Catholicism would be the only accepted religion in France. The French experiment in tolerance lasted less than a century. According to the Edict of Fontainebleau, Protestants were required to convert or leave the country. Most decided to leave. This emigration from France would have long-term consequences, as a significant proportion of the French middle class left the country for the Netherlands or Britain. Louis also intervened in the French economy. The system established by Louis and his economics minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, became known as mercantilism. Under this system, the central government micromanaged the economy by controlling imports and exports. The essential idea behind mercantilism is to buy the products of one's country in order to keep money within the country's borders. Mercantilists believed there was a fixed amount of money in the world, and it was the job of the king to get as much of that money as possible. Money was power, and the more money one king acquired, that meant that other kings had less. To accomplish this, kings set up high tariffs on foreign products. Tariffs are taxes on imports. Essentially, if someone wanted to buy a foreign product, he or she would have to pay an extra tax on top of the cost of the product. These tariffs were designed to make foreign goods more expensive than domestic and encourage domestic buying. And, if someone bought foreign goods, they'd be penalized and pay a tax to the treasury. Finally, Louis tried to extend his power by winning military glory. Glory, in fact, was one of the most important words for Louis. He wanted to be known as a military hero, and this statue, located just outside Versailles, depicts Louis as a conquering Roman hero. He built Europe's largest army, expanding beyond 100,000 soldiers for the first time. He used these soldiers to fight wars all across Europe. He claimed territories along his eastern border and fought for decades to make those lands his own. This map depicts Louis's conquests. The dark green areas depict France before the wars, and the light green areas on the eastern frontier are the areas conquered by Louis's armies. Although these territories might not seem extensive, when you consider the fact that he fought against England, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Netherlands, then it's quite an achievement. Also important was the conquest of the territories of Alsace and Lorraine. These lands would prove to be contentious, and France and Germany ultimately fought over them for nearly 3 centuries.